I'm an Iranian woman by birth, having left the country as a child in 1959 with my parents, an older sister, and an older brother. The journey and transition that took me and my family to America is still vivid in my mind. Although I was too young to fully understand the sacrifice made by my parents in uprooting their lives and that of their children, over the years, I eventually put the pieces of the puzzle together to discover that one of several main reasons which prompted them to immigrate to the US was to ensure for better opportunities for the education and future for their children, but especially for their two daughters. It was a complicated, difficult move, which only over time, truly over time, I began to understand more fully through conversations with my parents and my siblings. My parents were members of a minority religious community that was ill-treated, persecuted, and at times violently attacked by government and clerical decree. My parents' belief system viewed the education of all children as obligatory, gave precedence, if a choice had to be made, to the education of girls, and promoted the equality between women and men. In large part, it was these ideas that motivated my parents in their mid-40s to contemplate a radically different life for their children and themselves. The choice to uproot the family was not easy, and a new life in a new country was, as it always is for many immigrants, filled with obstacles, trials, and challenges. In the end, I believe my parents were happy with their choice. Their three children were given new opportunities and freedoms. They received the good education that they had hoped for, including the education of their daughters, which had been a source of anxiety for them back in Iran. I share this story not because I think it's unique, but because it is a story about the different forms of freedom, individuality, and self-distinctiveness that can take, and the different human yearnings for these forms of being. The freedom of thought, of conscience, of opportunity, of choice, of movement, of belief, of individual expression. For women, freedom and individuality continues to shape their history as women continue to struggle to achieve full equality and at the same time to be their genuine, authentic selves. The social realities of women's lives are always undergird deep-seated historical, philosophical, social, and religious notions about women belong, about where women belong, how they belong, and who they belong to. Over the centuries, women have been treated as chattels, confined to narrow spheres of activity, excluded from participation, deprived of a voice in public life, denied educational opportunities, and submitted to the further indignity of being forced to support and maintain the same patriarchal systems that treated them as second-class beings, as subhumans, embodiments of sin, witches, or soulless entities. To paraphrase Simone de Beauvoir, who in turn paraphrased Sartre, an ontology for women ought to determine a priori what a woman is, uncontested, unrelated, before definitions. Yet by placing women into a situated system before their identity is affirmed, women's identities are rooted in a prefabricated ideal. From an ontology that endorses male supremacy, comes an epistemology that benefits masculine identity and a taxonomy that symptomizes female exclusion. Sameness is not what we need among women. More than ever, we must be aware of each other's dissimilarities, our beautiful diversity and individuality. We must be generous and supportive in the latitude that we allow each other, and gracious in our lack of judgment. Nothing, I believe, is more freeing and authentic than for an individual to have the space and freedom to explore and come to terms with their own selfhood and individuality. This is what we need, and this is what it takes to keep an entire civilization afloat. Respect for each other, support for one another, women alongside each other and alongside all others, seen or unseen, leading, guiding, following, escorting, carrying through the breach. The world is getting exhausted. And yet women have the unique ability to present a vision of what a different and better world might look like. As has been so often seen throughout history, when the world gets exhausted, when violence and destruction have brought loss, devastation, and ruin, when all else has been attempted, people, communities, and nations have looked to women. They have embraced times when alternative voices are needed. They have looked to those who can chart a new course. Gospel singer Mahalia Jackson is a stunning example of how a woman's words and a woman's presence shaped the fabric and grammar of a uniquely American occurrence. A proud, God-fearing woman, Mahalia Jackson was standing, as so many women often do, just off to the side during one of history's greatest moments. As Martin Luther King gave his famous speech at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963, King's advisor Clarence Jones recalled that at that moment when Dr. King was contemplating the ending of his speech, he wasn't quite sure if he had the right ending. Mahalia Jackson cried out, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." His reaction, his advisor later said, his reaction to it was to look in the direction of Mahalia Jackson, but then to take the prepared text that he was reading and slide it to the left side of the lectern. A voice of a trusted and distinguished woman changed history on that day. Soviet dissident Irina Ratushanska turned her ghastly years in a labor camp into a triumph of the human spirit. She was a 29-year-old physicist when she was sentenced to 7 years in a labor camp for voicing her concern about human rights violations and for writing a disturbing set of poems. In the Gulag, she abided on a diet of rotten fish and broth and stale bread, nearly dying as a result. Refusing, as she said, to allow hatred to take root, she wrote poetry by using burned matchsticks to sketch poems on bars of soap. When I finished, she said, I would memorize it, meaning the poem, wash my hands, and send it down the drain. She transferred her memorized poems onto cigarette paper, smuggled out of prison to her husband, who had them published in the West. Irina said, about her tortured years in prison, they can't confiscate your brain. In one of her poems, Smuggled Out, she wrote, "I'll live through this, survive, and they'll ask me how they beat my head on the prison cot, how it froze during the nights." Later, in the same poem, she captures an elegant instance of beauty on a prism window in prison. And she says, "And I'll tell them about the first beauty which I saw in this captivity. Window in frost." Irina defies the brutality of her incarceration and instead turns her attention to the frost on the window. "Look close," she says. "You'll see it begins to blossom even more." She ends the poem by telling us about the violence of prism ice, which she then turns into a holiday and a gift. As a captive, she acutely appreciated life and never lost control of her dignity. "May we only survive," she said. And a decade or so after her release from prison, she reflected, "In a way, it's lucky to have a turbulent life. When everything is too easy, sometimes people lose their love of life. They lose enthusiasm. In a frigid garden, a measure of freedom still bloomed." The Iranian poet Simin Behbahani puts it this way: "To stay alive, you must slay silence." Behbahani lived long enough in Iran to witness mandatory removal of the veil, and then the compulsory wearing of the veil, and then the removal of the veil, and then the wearing of the veil. Her poems give voice to the oppressed. They rupture the muffled, silenced lives of Iranian women. In her poem entitled From the Street, number 6, Behbahani commemorates a woman killed by state in a moving poem and refers to the way the judge examines the law, which is hidden in his hand. The stark difference between the openness of her poem and the closed realm of the judge's law is stark. Behbahani combines the crushing forces of religion, law, and patriarchy to describe an episode in which a woman is slayed by stoning. When the woman confessed for the 4th time, stoning her became necessary. As commanded by religion, the judge had opened this knot with his own hands, revealing the hidden secret to the public. Behbahani's poetry and her voice speak to the rights of every person, avoiding engagement in party politics and never resorting to violence as an answer to repression and injustice. Behbahani, like so many women, defied the grinding, crushing, violent control of tyranny. In May 2008, Mahfash Sabet was arrested along with several others. They were sentenced to 10 years in prison, primarily for adhering to a religion that promulgated the idea that men and women were equal, and thereby equal before not only God but man. Detained in a 13 by 16-foot cell, she noted, and I quote, "A prison does not merely consist of high walls and barbed wire. They accuse you, threaten you, abuse you, curse you, humiliate you. And you have to endure it all, knowing that this could lead to further charges, more indictments, longer imprisonment ahead. Worse than this was that they wanted me to forget who I was. They wanted me to forget what I believed, forget my identity." This will sound similar to some of our own remembrances of an at times difficult latter half of the 20th century in North America. As will her means of preservation and solace. She says, "I found that I could express my deepest feelings through my poems. They could contain my misery and my suffering, my anguish, at being separated from my friends and my family, and in addition to recording painful moments of crises, they became the place where I could record my little victories. And in one of her poems, she writes, "What are they going to do to us in this perilous place in prison of loss? But what can they do to a handful of dust in the middle of chaos? If they cut open our veins, red tulips will blush like blood in the fields. If they padlock our lips, the mouths of 1,000 spring buds are unsealed." The last example, and I'm coming to a conclusion, concerns the 45-year-old African-American woman, Harriet Tubman, who in 1868 asked the United States Senate for 3 years back pay for hired work she had done during the Civil War. She had worked as a nurse, as a hired work, she had worked as a nurse, a cook, and commander of several men. During the Civil War, she was appointed commander of an expedition in South Carolina, where she and several men who were assigned to her penetrated enemy lines and successfully destroyed railroads, bridges, cut off major supplies for the rebel troops. On July 10, 1863, the Commonwealth, a Boston newspaper, reported the following: "Colonel Montgomery and his gallant band of 300 black soldiers, under the guidance of a black woman, dashed into enemy's country, struck a bold and effective blow, destroying millions of dollars worth of commissary stores, cotton, and lordly dwellings, and striking terror into the heart of rebeldom. Brought off near 800 slaves and thousands of dollars worth of property without losing a man or receiving a scratch. It was a glorious consummation." That's the newspaper story. The mission was led by Harriet Tubman. You know, she was born a slave in Maryland, in Dorchester County, Maryland, where she escaped slavery and became a major force as an abolitionist on the Underground Railroad. The Boston newspaper wrote of Miss Tubman's campaign, "It is significant as the only military engagement in American history wherein a woman, black or white, led the raid and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted. The whole venture," the newspaper said, "owed its success to the complete preliminary survey made by Harriet Tubman's espionage troops." So now, writing about this incident more than a century later, the late, great Toni Morrison wrote, 30 years after Miss Tubman, black, female, mother, daughter, nurse, cook, wife, and commander of several men, asked a room full of sexist, I'm quoting Morrison, asked a room full of sexist, bigoted, class-conscious white men for her back pay. They granted it. Morrison explains that the reason she chose to write about this incident in one of her talks was because, and I quote, "The key to feminine oppression is most clearly seen in the response of her stand, a response that gathered together the full force of the special brand of American racism and sexism. And don't think she didn't know that. Don't think that she wasn't aware of that. They gave her $20 a month for life. She was 75 years old then. And they probably did not expect the pension to have to last very long. Stubborn as a woman, she lived 13 more years." Toni Morrison goes on to say, "If you took the gaze of the white male, or even the white female, but certainly the male, out of the world, it was freedom. You could think, and you would think anything, go anywhere, imagine anything. There was no longer the problem of looking through the master's gaze. Women, I guess what I'm trying to say, have never shied away from making their contributions to the world, even under the most difficult of circumstances. As women continue to advance their goal and desire for attaining equality, as they bring their influence and capacities into every corner of the world, women will have, in my opinion, achieved the precondition to the attainment of peace. I think in large part, my thoughts about the subject matter began when I was asked, first when I decided to organize this conference about women. It triggered something in me that I think I had buried for a while. But also, I think what happened was that I was asked to write an article for a sociological journal about freedom and the Iranian women. And writing that article did something to me. And it was good. It was one of those moments where things awaken in you that help you understand things better. The assignment was very difficult, but very illuminating. Iranian women, like so many, many around the world, are breathtaking in their acts of courage, strength, and endurance as they live day-to-day lives under laws of censorship, suppression, and control. Self-expression for Iranian women and so many, many women around the world can be a matter of life and death. They lack legal protection, and their basic human rights are unprotected. They, like so many other women around the world, endure psychological, physical harassment, beatings, torture, and are subject to untold injustices. But despite all that, despite all of those restrictions and boundaries that restrict them, they demonstrate their astonishing, sensitive, emotional, and intellectual creativity through expressions in poetry, literature, film, and other artistic forms, and they support each other. Their nonviolent movement for selfhood, for individuality, for their freedom, has persisted for almost 40 years. Like many other suppressed women around the world, they courageously persist through their bold actions in advancing their peaceful, nonviolent, and moral movement to obtain nothing more than their full equality. In all of our analysis of the lives of women in the world, let us make sure that we continue to remember their example, their bold actions. Let us also pay tribute to them and honor them. Let us be reminded and challenged by these stories. The conference set for today and tomorrow, as I said, features scholars who represent multiple disciplines and whose topics explore many sides of why women have not yet achieved full equality. As we hear their presentations, we will have a more robust understanding of the important topic of women's equality and its relationship to making the world a better place. Thank you.